Wonderful. I've got a brilliant panel with me. We're going to be talking about the issue of inclusive assessment and thinking together about ways that we've seen things adapted and working really well so that they bring out every young person's talent. So we might touch on themes around ESOL, we might touch on themes around inclusivity of disability, but we're going to keep things broad and we're going to talk a lot about inclusivity and adaptation. We want to make it quite interactive, so we're going to bring in the panel, share some examples, talk a little bit, but I want to bring it out and see what themes have come up from you today and bring you into the conversation quite quickly. So that's the plan. Welcome everyone, it's lovely to see you. We're going to ask you, as promised, to share something, a bit about yourself, but then to share a really good example of something you've seen that's inspired you, that's been very inclusive. So let's start with you, Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa Farnham. I'm the CEO of ASDAN. And when we were first asked about the question, I was quizzing myself, are we talking about neurodivergent learners, learners where linguistic barriers are a diverse area that we appreciate, but the system doesn't appreciate, or those who have got inconsistent sort of education exposure, which I'm sure we've all worked with. I'm going to briefly just allude to why I became the CEO of ASDAN. I know there's a couple of people here that have heard some of this before. So I have had, as a head teacher, I had a student called Alex, amazing young lady with Asperger's, sat her GCSEs, she got all 11 GCSEs, absolutely amazing. The pressure of that over the summer with Asperger's, she had a breakdown. She didn't recall any of those GCSEs. So she couldn't move into the A-level world, but we started looking at project-based learning, which is where I learned about ASDAN in the first place. And then another young man who I'd talk about where English was another language for him, but he was an amazing young person, but wasn't given the space or time to be able to develop his linguistic skills. He still got 9 GCSEs and did amazingly, but just before Christmas, about November time, I read his eulogy, because he couldn't then take that pressure. So my good piece around all of this is when I first arrived at ASDAN, we did a survey with all of our learners. We're in 4,000 schools, and all of those learners, we wanted to know what did they think. And one of the boldest statements that stood out for me was really simple. It was a young lady that just said, when I do exams, they see knowledge. What they don't see is how I use that knowledge. So can we just do a bit of both so I can show you I'm ready to learn and move forwards? So I think that's the boldest thing that I wanted to share around this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I think it's the biggest clue that any of us are going to learn is listening to those young people's voices. Beautifully put.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Fran, share a little bit about you and an example or a reflection from your work.
Thanks, Melissa, as well. That was a brilliant way to start. My name is Fran Wilby. I'm with Rethinking Assessment, but I have another hat on today also representing the Enrichment for All Coalition. So I'll be thinking about sharing examples across both. I guess when we're thinking about great examples, one of my questions is how does this start to fill up the bucket of enriched experiences from which we then draw at that assessment moment? So my question is always, what's the stimulus for assessment? We can't just keep on assessing and doing more unless we also think about how we're filling up those experiences for young people. So an enriched experience, and a great example of this is Park Community School near Havant. I don't know if any of you know Park School. It's absolutely brilliant. It's a state school, nearly 1,000 pupils, working really hard to serve their community. They think about their school improvement in terms of 60 years. So instead of 3 to 5 years, they're thinking about serving their community over 3 generations. And a couple of the things that they do to kind of fill up this bucket of enriched experiences, they very much bring in the FE model to their experiences for Key Stage 3 and 4 learners. So what that looks like is they have a construction centre, not kind of big and fancy, quite basic, but they take learners down there to learn construction skills, building walls, etc., really hands-on, physical, practical. They have a small holding where the young people can work with animals, the young people can go into the kitchen, develop culinary skills, and they also have a print shop which is commercial. We get our printing done over there as well. So really those experiences are building all the way, not just from Key Stage 4 but Key Stage 3, and they've also added in other qualifications at that stage as well. They also have a STAR curriculum in Year 7, which is their kind of transition tool, which builds in all the skills we've been talking about today already. So, developing them into great thinkers, they call it, independent thinkers. So that's right the way through from year 7. And then the final thing they do is something called Rich Challenges, which is really around then that authentic learning. So one of the things they're doing at year 7 as part of this curriculum is a module on identity and who am I. And one of the challenges was to go out into their community and think about oral histories, and they then had to share those stories as part of the assessment. So it's authentic, it's meaningful to them, and it's filling up that bucket of experiences from which you then draw at the assessment point. So that's that.
Fran, thank you so much for that example. And you're already starting to see some themes in what we're talking about, authenticity, a reason why we're doing it. So yeah, Michael, take us a little bit further.
Thanks so much, Ollie. I'm Michael from Skillsbuilder Partnership. We're a charity, and we're trying to make sure that one day everybody's got the essential skills like speaking and listening and teamwork and leadership to really succeed and to thrive. So I threw this question to the team, and they all came back with one really strong set of examples. And they said, if you want really good examples of inclusive assessment, think about early years. So, oh, interesting. Why? And they kept coming back to thoughts like informed observation and great kind of environmental design. But there was one common denominator, actually, and it was about moving from testing to narrating. And when I get a difficult question like this, I often look at the etymologies of words. And the etymology of assessment is assay, which means to sit beside. And that's really interesting, actually. What does it mean to sit beside something or someone when you're assessing something? What might that mean? It might be a shared experience. It might mean that there's a shared dialogue. And it might mean that there's a shared language. And that's one of the things which we're really, really keen to do at Skillsbuilder, which we can draw on in a bit later on, about having that common language of assessment. What does it actually mean to be assessed? You might emerge with some kind of strange cipher at the end, a number or a letter. What does that letter or number mean? Maybe we need a dialogue. Maybe we need to sit beside people when we're assessing them.
Thank you, Michael. Really, really helpful. And last but not least, Andrew.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Peterson. I'm Professor of Character and Citizenship Education at the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues, University of Birmingham. We are a research, policy and practice centre working with schools and other organisations in the UK, around the world, to advocate really for the importance of character education, the education and development in children, young people, and indeed in adults, of virtues for the living a good life and hopefully living a flourishing life as well. As far as assessment's concerned, probably I said in my workshop that I ran earlier, the one main question we get asked anytime we talk about character education, perhaps alongside whether virtues are truly universal, is how do you assess, and even should we be assessing character and virtues? Now, we have to sort of navigate a path between the fact that we don't want to be going around necessarily giving judgments about children and young people's character and how honest or dishonest they are, for example, but equally, just as human beings, as parents, as teachers, as educators, as friends, we are involved in making judgments about people's character as we go through our lives. None of us are perfect, of course. In terms of inspiring practices, there's a whole wealth of different approaches, from we don't assess character at all to we take a very sort of regimented and detailed approach to assessment of character education in schools. But I think what stands out really is where schools are trying to be really true to the philosophical idea of what a virtue is and what character is, and how that assessment might fit in with that, rather than what's necessarily simple and easy to assess. So, for example, rather than just assessing behavioural actions and outcomes, that they're really thinking about what it means to have an internalised disposition and the various components of virtue. And then one thing that just made me think, I think it's reasonably interesting, when I spoke to the Association for Character Education that the Centre established, Chief Executive, a couple of weeks ago, saying I was doing this, did he have any great practice from school? He shared me a rubric. School's got about 6 or 7 virtues, they're the school values or virtues. Shared a rubric, 3 scales so people can mark where they are. I assumed this was for students to self-assess and report on, but actually it was for staff. So I think that also raises questions. We say a lot at the centre that character education starts with staff, and staff as role models, and thinking through what virtues they convey and possess as educators. It also raises questions, really tricky and perhaps dangerous questions about how we assess, or should we assess, staff character as well.
I love that. So one of the themes that's come out of what you've said, which is a passion of mine, is thinking about what different phases of education can teach each other. So your point, Michael, about early years, what we were just hearing about kind of FE, it's important to remember that at different stages, we think it's right that we assess in certain ways. We think it's right that we assess holistically. Or in an apprenticeship, we're like, absolutely, we should work out whether the person can do the job. And then for some reason in the middle, particularly around kind of secondary school, we kind of forget that and think actually, I'm saying it is thought that we should only kind of focus on assessing knowledge. So let's come straight into that point that you made, Andrew, about this question that comes back to us collectively a lot. Why should we assess these? Surely assessment is just about how much you know, weighing the pig. Why are we trying to assess these esoteric skills, virtues, enrichment? Michael, that must come to you a lot at Skillsbuilder. Like your whole framework is about assessing skills. Why?
I think one reason is, if you think about the word assessment, I think it has this very powerfully constricting effect. And we've talked about some of the emotional and physical reactions of that in the morning. And I think, part of it, I think people constrict around the concept of rigor. Like we need rigor. We need it to be robust. And I think I completely agree. And it's partly because people see this kind of counterpoint, or maybe this kind of battle between knowledge and skills. And I think more and more we think actually we need to think about those two things as really complementary. So why do we need to do it, or how do we need to do it? We need to do it in a really kind of powerful and complementary way that we can actually show that there is value in assessing skills. Yeah,
I think that's so important, and that word rigor is so powerful. It's such a Nick Gibb kind of word. I remember seeing when I was in the States, so we saw this example of like a passage presentation, and a school had replaced their written exams with some written exams, and then an opportunity for young people to stand up in front of an audience of their peers, their parents, other people's parents, and the staff of the school for an hour, and to talk about 3 beautiful pieces of work that they'd done, to defend them, and most importantly to talk about the skills they got from them and how they'd applied that in a different area of their life. And I saw this young woman give this amazing presentation about what she learned from English, how to construct an argument, and how in her personal life she'd taken that into a charity that supported young Latina women like herself to stand up to authority, to be the one in the family who was writing the letter back to the council to stop the family getting evicted. And I was thinking, how could you not say that is rigorous? That is not a written exam, but that was something that would have been way out of my comfort zone when I was that age. So I think that sticking to that rigor point is really, really important. Let's stick to this point of like, why are we assessing these things? It's a really good start, Michael. With your work, Fran, on enrichment, like surely that's just kind of fun stuff that we get up to in Cubs after school for me. What should we be? What's the kind of added value of assessing that?
Yeah, thanks, Olly. Because as we were talking about this, my feeling is there's a moral imperative to teach these skills, particularly as in the work that we're coming across. This links very closely to the needs of certain communities. So if you're thinking about NEET figures or youth unemployment figures, enrichment is the space where we are providing opportunities for young people to grow a passion, find something they're interested in. That may lead to employment later down the line, yes, but it also, as we heard this morning from Clara, it's the space where young people build confidence, they find out who they are, they build resilience. So I would argue, enrichment is the bit that you must have in order to then support learners on to the next phases. They've got something to build on, yes, linking the core curriculum, but that really gives them the motivation and the why. And if we are going to have potentially a generation where work is difficult to get into, young people need other things in their lives, that maybe that's voluntary work to begin with, and maybe that's community engagement. There needs to be something for them, and enrichment isn't the fluffy, it's the essential, I would argue.
Okay, so if we believe Michael and Fran about why, and I come to Melissa and then Andrew about how if we've decided these things are good things to assess, how can we do that in a way that is inclusive and brings out the best in young people?
I suppose I'd start with can you imagine if we decided in school to treat the children like we do our staff and put smart targets in place, like really smart targets, and it was measurable and achievable, maybe get that word really focused, because that's how we nurture our staff teams. As a school leader, that's how I would have nurtured my staff team, and hopefully they saw that, nurture them. And then we look at that performance and that progress, and we actually support them. You spend time with your staff helping them navigate a way to move forward. I admit, with a class of 30 in front of you, that becomes a little bit trickier. But actually, we started thinking in that way and assessing in that way. So the universal design for learning hasn't gone away. CASLO hasn't gone away. At the moment, we're part of the CASLO research study where Ofqual are looking at what went wrong, what was lost. ASDAN, without selling ASDAN, for 35 years we have stayed with that model. In 2010 we could have gone a different way and put endpoint assessment in place, but it's the wrong thing to do, because there is a multitude, I think we heard yesterday or read maybe in a very long white paper, that 60% of learners, it's not the 30% that disadvantaged anymore, we're talking about 60% of learners that are finding it challenging to stay within the margins we've put in place. So I think having a mixture, a hybrid model of assessment is going to be so key. It's exactly what you do with your staff. If they want to develop professionally, you might actually give them an interview, which kind of feels like an exam. The rest of the time, you're constantly assessing them. So why aren't we doing that with young people and actually giving them the skills to also get promoted one day, to also be able to survive and thrive in the workplace? So I think that multi-model needs to come into place. How we do it is how I think we need those first mover schools that were being talked about earlier. There are lots of them. We work with lots of schools that are already using different ways of assessing in a very creative way, and what we're seeing is learners increase between 10 and 85%. A school out in Dubai we went to visit a few weeks ago, 85% increase in progress for maths for a cohort of 5 learners, just because they were being taught differently with a plan, do, review process of actually having agency in their learning. That's not traditional, that's a bit of a one-off, but generally with the research that we've done, about 10% of learners who have an opportunity to learn in that different and more enriching way will make better progress. Exams need to be there, they are really important, but we're actually going to help people achieve with mix it up for them, give them a bit of work-life balance in their work.
Nice. So personalised, multimodal, formative, and I really like this point about, and obviously it's a passion of mine, thinking about what they're going to face in the workplace. Like, why are we doing something so different for those young people compared to our staff, if those young people are going to become our staff in 10 years' time? Andrew, what's your...
Great. Thank you. So I think that focus on the formative is absolutely crucial and vital. But if we think about the development or the formation of human beings, that holistic formation, well, that happens all the time. So 90%, if not more, of what goes on in schools, in families, at homes, elsewhere, has a formative impact and gives a sense of whether young people are valued, are trusted, are encouraged, whether their character is recognised, is celebrated, or is sort of rejected or marginalised or neglected in some way. And I think in my head as a former teacher and as a parent, when I think about assessment, I immediately think of those formative things, whether it's very formative or, very structured and formal, rather than formative, with rubrics, tests, those sort of formal assessments. But actually, I think as far as character development and that more holistic personal development are concerned, well, those things are important, and schools are doing that and thinking about ways they can do that fairly, constructively. The informal matters at least as much, if not more. The feedback we have on our own character from our friends, as children and young people do, but also those informal interactions with teachers and other role models that children and young people have within classrooms, within corridors, and elsewhere in the school. And just from my own research, I've researched this sort of area for nearly 20 years now, different countries. If I say to teachers, I'd be the same myself as a teacher, where do these things happen in school, whether it's intercultural understanding, whether it's citizenship, whether it's welcoming newly arrived unaccompanied refugee and asylum seeker children, whether it's character, whether it's citizenship, we always often go for the formal things, the curriculum, the whole school days, the activities, the clubs, diversity ceremonies, so on and so forth. When I speak to children of different ages, they tend to focus not so much on those. They do talk about those, but first and foremost, they talk about conversations they've had in the playground with their peers. They talk about the interactions they've had with teachers or learning support assistants, and so on. So I think that informal, that ethos, what we call character court, but that informal, the ethos, the relationships, but to really understand and embed that, children and young people, as we do as adults and teachers, need a language and a vocabulary. So if we have a very clear language and vocabulary, it doesn't solve everything, but it at least makes things a bit easier, and hopefully we can have some shared understanding within our organisations.
It's a really good point, and that kind of unites all four of your perspectives, I think, that shared point. So from Michael's universal framework on skills, from Fran's work on enrichment, from the ASDAN qualifications, and from your work on character education, these are not about being prescriptive, having a single way of doing things, but they are about having a single way of talking about things so that we're sharing vocabulary, we're not confusing ourselves. Employers tell us all the time how confusing it is when they're interviewing to have so many different qualifications, so many different ways of talking about things. So perhaps we're in the space of a universal language, but not a kind of a single way of doing things. I want to open this up. I'm going to give the audience a gift, which is that you don't have to pretend that you're asking a question. If you just want to make a point, that's totally fine as well. Just keep it short. But have you got examples that stand out to you of inclusive education? Have you been hearing things that you think actually things are different or things are the same where I am? I'd love to invite just a couple of comments and we'll just reflect on those again as a group. Don't be shy. I know you're all keen and interested in this area. So yeah, let's have a couple of thoughts and reflections from the floor. We've got a shy audience. Perfect. I think you're just going to project your teacherly voice.
I can try that.
There we are.
Phil Avery, Director of Education for the Multi Academy Trust. I think my comment, but also question to the panel, is that we're advocating for these inclusive ways of assessment around competencies. Are there things that we want to keep out of the system? Because if they end up in the system, they're going to end up becoming higher stakes. They're going to end up, So I'm interested in reflections in how we've got Skillsbuilder, ASDAN, really an enrichment. Do we end up creating something that we never intended by bringing them in?
Nice. So are the things that we want to safeguard and keep outside the formal system so that they don't become part of the structure? Yeah. Who'd like to pick up? Melissa, go for it.
I got asked by a CEO at the beginning of last year of a very, very large multi-academy trust who asked me, how can I justify the proxy data, which is the data you're, in theory, talking about? And I said, don't call it that, for starters, because it's these character skills, but actually it's the metacognition skills that we want young people to have. So I think you're right, there are some areas that we need to keep out to an extent because we need to protect that time for a young person to grow and not feel that they are being assessed all the time. But there's opportunities that are coming up. So the careers work placement demand that's being put upon, I'm saying demand, that was a bit harsh, wasn't it? That's being put back into every school, which I think every school wants to. There's a great opportunity there for schools to really capture with purpose the character skills of a young person, the enrichment skills of a young person. So I think there's a nice space there that's been opened up to schools to do it. But I agree, I think there are some areas that need to be protected, and also we also need to move away from the theory, I think, that is in many schools, that for a young person who has barriers to learning, then we just look at whether they've got good character, that we'll just look, can they manage to reciprocate a conversation? They can, we just need to adapt on how they're going to do it and meet them where they're at. And I think there's something that needs to happen there, but again, we need brave schools to start doing it. And I think there are a lot out there, but they keep really quiet, like the audience.
Well, one other reflection from me, and then I'll open up if anyone else to come on that, but it feels to me like one aspect of protecting could be not necessarily not measuring or not doing the things that we're talking about, but keeping it out of the hands of government. And in a way, the work that you're doing is really strong in that space. So we've got a good example in this area, the Gatsby benchmarks. They're a really good example, and I'm a big policy nerd, as many of you know, of a different kind of policy making. Like, it's something that has developed outside government, has been anointed by government as the right thing, and has therefore got that stability over kind of 5 to 10 years. Absolutely brilliant. I would love to see things like the work that Fran's doing on enrichment like just stay just clear of government, so that there's not that temptation with the new minister to add an extra benchmark, take one out, halve the number. Similarly, Skillsbuilder framework, that exists outside. So if that can get kind of anointed as the one we use, but not owned by government and sucked in, maybe that's a way of protecting. Does anyone want to come in just on that protection point? Perfect. Let's take another sort of wave at the back. Perfect. Go for it.
Hello, I'm Claire Jarmy. I'm the Director of Innovation at Haberdashers Elston School. So we're currently putting together what we're calling a habits framework, which is a sort of character framework, or a curriculum that's going with it. And we also want to be effectively assessing these 12 traits that we've identified. I'd like quite a practical answer. How do I, given that this is a very personal thing that you're assessing, how do I avoid a kid coming out feeling like they've been told, like, I'm the kid with no resilience, I'm the kid with low integrity? So I'd really like to hear your kind of some practical answers about that.
Thank you, Claire. Great question. Andrew, I'm going to unsurprisingly come to you first on that one, and others can come in too.
Yeah, I think it's going to sound a little controversial what I'm about to say, but hopefully I definitely don't mean it in the way it might come across. I think largely it depends whether that child is the child with low resilience, or and the reasons for that, and that's about honesty and conversations and using teacher judgment and wisdom. One of the things I've really struggled with as a parent, as a former teacher, with my son's school, is it's taken me quite a while to convince the school I want the truth. And I don't want to hear stuff that just isn't true because they're scared that I'm going to get cross with them. And so actually, if we create conditions under which we have a language and we have shared trust, that's really more challenging, I think, in England because of, in certain schools and for certain communities as well, because of the relationship between parents and schools that might be at play. But if the decision and the judgment makes sense and it's framed in a particular way, then I think those conversations are healthy. They're part of our growth as individual and as communities. I'll just give a brief example of, we do work with a consortium of schools, really mixed range of schools in Kazakhstan, and had the opportunity to visit there last year. Fundamentally focused on character and holistic development, but parents are brought in at each and every stage. Now, they have a different culture with parental involvement, but those conversations, as long as they're sort of accurate and sound judgments made in a supportive, formative way, the challenge comes, of course, where they're not accurate and the judgments aren't supportive, then there's real issues. Another challenge is, that children, particularly in terms of their character, present themselves very differently in different domains of their lives. So it's also about, are we assessing, or are we making these judgments based on how they are in the classroom and extracurricular activities, or even how they are outside of the school as well? And clearly, the more holistic we can make the basis of the judgment, the better. So I'm not sure that answers, but...
And can I just ask a quick follow-up to Andrew, and then I'll bring it up open to the rest of the panel. But is this really about starting to bring in the kind of growth mindset idea to these skills? Because there's something innate in the way that we sometimes think about these, like, and it goes to your work as well, Michael, like, I'm not a great communicator, or, like an integral part of somebody's character. And what we're saying is actually all of these things are things that we all learn, we all can get better at, and therefore we're not saying you're stuck or you're bad. We're saying constructively this is an area where you can grow.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of responses. The first one is, we're not massive fans as a centre of growth mindset. It's quite limited, it's quite flawed. But more importantly, we take a different approach, which is sort of the Aristotelian approach, because part of the problem with positive psychology, it's sort of well-intentioned, but self-esteem's a good example. It's almost like the more self-esteem you can have, the better. But actually, lots of studies show that the people with the most self-esteem are narcissists. So I won't go into all the philosophy, but Aristotle had this idea of the golden mean. It's about having the right amount of something for the right reasons at the right time. And the standard example is, what's brave for me might be very different to what's brave for an SAS soldier, for example. And that depends on context. But it's also about who we are as individuals, and that we all have strengths and we all have areas that we're not so strong at in terms of our character. But if we focus, we have to focus holistically, of course, but if we focus on what we might be known as, how would others describe us, for example? How would we describe ourselves? How would we like to be described by others? Then that gets us a bit closer to a more holistic understanding.
Brilliant. We're going to come down the line for any advice for Claire, and then we're just going to ask for one last reflection from each of you as well. So, Michael, anything on that practical point from Claire?
Yes, great question. I think I'd draw out two things. I think it's starting from a strengths-based as opposed to a deficit model, and it's about framing habits, skills as continuous rather than static. And that's clearly an important part of formative assessment. And the best example I've seen of this recently is at the RAF, actually, just picking up the SAS point, where you get incredible continuous formative assessment. And I think through that prism and lens, what you're not looking for is a completely uniform picture where everyone's like at the top grade. You end up with quite a spiky profile for different people. So yeah, maybe that's just a kind of almost like shifting the mindset slightly from expecting everyone to kind of come out with top grades and to have every single disposition and character trait you could possibly imagine.
Thank you. I guess I would also pose the question, who and what is it for? So if you're assessing that, are the young people clear about what's the purpose of that? Because if it's developmental and it's for their own benefit, that's a different conversation. So I guess practically some of the things I've seen that work really well are, for example, Surrey Square. On their learner profiles at the end of the year, they go home as parent reports and the young people present them to their parents. There are two values or attributes that they choose themselves. So I think one approach is really nice to say we're looking at this range of skills and they pick one strength and they pick one area of development. And I think that's a really nice way of doing it because it's driven by the young person, and also with the caveat it needs to be clear what's the purpose of this.
I would go back to one of Andrew's point around the looking at, is it a transitional skill you're looking for, and so therefore give the agency of assessment to that young person, because they're the ones who will need to be able to see where they can transition it to, because school may be a really complex place for them, or home may be more complex, for them to be able to transition that skill that you're wanting to develop. I think, again, there's a lot of research that notes that shame is one of the most disabling barriers to a young person's learning. So looking at habits is quite a hard thing. It's quite a hard word. I'm sure you've thought long and hard about it, but habits get associated with bad things a lot of the time. So you're trying to look at those more positive behaviours, habit. None of the words suit it, do they really? But I think it's looking at that they need to have complete agency in that assessment, I think, beyond the adult that's supporting them.
Wonderful. This has been a very quick and rich conversation. And I come back for one closing thought from each of you. Just while that moulds, I wanted to share one from myself, which is, I was talking to my partner the other day who is Dutch. And in the Netherlands, there is this thing called the 6 mindset. And that is basically, if you're getting 6 out of 10, you're doing great. Why don't you go and do something else? Why don't you concentrate on something else? So it's not like, why don't you get an 8? Why don't you get a 9? It's like, why don't you go and spend some time outside? Why don't you go and learn a language? Why don't you go and shoot a bow and arrow? And I think that's kind of just a cool, different cultural approach. Let's come back to the line. Final thoughts from you, Melissa, and then we'll work our way along.
I would say, I think from an assessment point of view, we need to start creating a situation or a space where young people can contribute, not just turn up for assessment. And I think that's really important.
Final thoughts. I think we've talked a lot about multimodal. I think it's about multimodal, multi-measure, so skills as well as knowledge, multi-moment, so we're getting learners to kind of practice. It's not all at the end of the year, and it should be meaningful. And that's the thing that I keep coming back to, that young people are clear about why this is important to them, then I think that's half the battle.
Thanks, Fran. I think I'm still reflecting on Michael Rosen, and I think one reason is just the power of creativity, actually. And I wonder whether, again, I think assessment has this effect of just shutting down your thinking. And can we be really open and creative in the way that we approach assessment? And I think we've had some great examples of that in this panel. Thanks.
Thank you. Just following on really from the comments and supporting them and saying I think it goes back to purpose, and particularly in this whole area of personal development or character or skills, it's about what's the purpose of the assessment, and is it aiming to support these children and young people? Is it aiming to help them to develop a better sense of themselves, of their relationship to others, of who they want to be in the future, who they ought to be in the future, then that, if it is, then that's all to the good. If it's other purposes, then that's probably less to the good. But what's the purpose of the assessment, and how is it helping to form people? And often for many children, focusing and having these conversations not just gives them a language, but gives them a bit more confidence. So again, it's not a deficit or fixing model. It's about recognition, celebration, and helping children, again, particularly children from certain backgrounds and certain disadvantages, to be able to have more confidence and more awareness of what they are, who they are, and what they've achieved.
Brilliant. Can I have a huge round of applause for my excellent panel?